Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
I always trusted my parents. I believed them when they told me that they were saving every penny for my college tuition, that my future was their priority, and that they wanted me to succeed because I deserved it. I worked hard in school, I applied to scholarships, and I planned my life around the assumption that they had my back. My brother Blake, on the other hand, was the golden child who could do no wrong, the one who got everything handed to him without question. I didn't resent him, I just assumed my parents were being fair. I never questioned it until one day, everything collapsed. It started with an offhand comment from my mom while she was on the phone with my aunt. She didn't realize I was in the next room, and she said it so casually that at first, I thought I misheard. She said something about paying Blake's MBA tuition in full, and I froze. I didn't understand it at first, because I knew I was supposed to have the college fund. I had numbers, spreadsheets, everything tracked for years. I had seen how the money grew. How could it suddenly vanish, and why hadn't they mentioned it to me? I stayed where I was, silent, listening. My dad chimed in, laughing as if this was nothing, and that was the moment it hit me. They had spent my tuition on Blake. My mouth went dry, my stomach sank, and I couldn't breathe properly. I wanted to run in, demand answers, yell, scream, and make them see the betrayal, but something inside me held back. I couldn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I retreated into silence, forced a calm exterior, and started plotting how I could survive without them. It felt like being punched in the gut by the people who were supposed to protect you, but instead of falling apart completely, I realized I had to figure out how to stand on my own 2 feet, smarter than they expected, and without asking for a single dollar from them ever again. Blake was oblivious, of course. He never knew or cared that the money came from my future. He was excited about his MBA, bragging about classes and networking events, while I carried the secret that had changed my life. My parents never told me, not directly. They acted like everything was normal, like I had no right to know. Every question I tried to ask about financial plans or tuition got vague responses, smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and an unmistakable sense that I wasn't meant to challenge anything. I realized then that staying silent didn't just protect me emotionally, it gave me time to plan. I could finish college on my own terms, and when I did, they wouldn't get a single thing from me ever again. I started looking at my options in earnest. I researched scholarships, grants, part-time jobs, anything I could do to cover tuition without touching my parents. It was exhausting, emotionally and physically, but the thought of proving that I could do it myself kept me going. I didn't want sympathy, I didn't want pity, and I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me. I wanted independence, and I wanted them to understand, eventually, that I didn't need them, and that their betrayal had no power over my life unless I allowed it. Meanwhile, the tension in the house grew, though no one ever acknowledged it directly. My parents treated me like I was still dependent, throwing small digs and comments about Blake's opportunities and success, as if rubbing it in was normal, and I kept my calm. Every time they mentioned him, I tightened my jaw, smiled politely, and reminded myself that my turn would come. They couldn't see it, and they didn't suspect that I was already preparing my silent revenge, my ultimate plan to show that I could rise higher than they ever imagined and make them regret underestimating me. I told no one what I knew. Not friends, not teachers, not anyone who could even hint at the truth. I didn't need anyone to intervene. I had to finish college on my own, and I had to do it completely independent of them so that every achievement, every milestone, would be mine alone. The idea of one day telling them, of showing them that I not only survived but thrived without their money, without their support, became my quiet obsession. I imagined the look on their faces when they realized that I didn't need a single dollar from them and that all their favoritism toward Blake couldn't touch me anymore. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, about proving that I wasn't powerless, about turning the tables without them even realizing it until it was too late. That realization, that quiet fury, became the fuel that pushed me forward, even when I was exhausted, even when I doubted myself. I knew that my path wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that by the time I was done, I would have the ultimate satisfaction of knowing that I had one on my own terms, and they would be left with nothing but the consequences of their own choices. And that was just the beginning. After I realized that my parents had taken my tuition money to pay for Blake's MBA, I had to face the reality that no one was coming to fix this for me, and I had no choice but to figure it out myself. Which was terrifying and exhausting at the same time, but I couldn't let them see me crumble because that would only give them power over me, and I wasn't about to hand it back, not after everything. I started by applying for every scholarship I could find, even the ones that seemed impossible, and I worked part-time jobs during evenings and weekends, some of them grueling and completely unglamorous, just to make sure I could cover tuition without asking for a single cent from my parents, who had made it very clear that they had no intention of supporting me, at least not financially. And I needed to find a way to finish school on my own terms while keeping my dignity intact, which was harder than it sounds when your own family has already shown they are willing to betray you. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by bills, scholarship applications, and a list of deadlines that seemed endless, and I felt completely overwhelmed for the first few weeks because I had never had to do this entirely on my own. And it was one thing to know I could work hard, but it was another to realize that the stakes were so high that failure wasn't an option, and I had to keep pushing even when I wanted to quit or when I felt resentful and angry at my parents, who were living their lives as if nothing had happened, celebrating Blake's success, while my own future seemed like a cliff I had to climb without a safety net. Working nights at a coffee shop and weekends at a bookstore left me physically drained, but it also gave me a sense of independence that I had never felt before because every dollar I earned was mine. And I was finally learning to manage responsibilities that I had never imagined handling at such a young age, which built my confidence in a way that my parents' betrayal never could have, and I started to realize that this struggle, as unfair as it was, might actually make me stronger in the long run because I was forced to rely on myself, and I was discovering that I had resources, skills, and resilience that no one had bothered to recognize before, not even my own parents. The tension at home was noticeable, though unspoken, because my parents would casually ask about Blake's progress or about helping me in ways that were really just patronizing. And I learned to answer politely while keeping my anger and resentment buried underneath a calm exterior, and every time they tried to belittle my efforts, I reminded myself that this was temporary, that eventually the power dynamic would shift, and they would see that their favoritism and their choices had not only failed to control me, but had actually forced me to grow in ways that would make their judgment irrelevant, which became my quiet motivation, the thing that kept me going even when the nights were long, the work exhausting. And the thought of Blake's advantage weighed heavily on me. I discovered a scholarship that seemed out of reach at first, one that required essays, recommendations, and interviews, but I pushed myself to apply and to prepare every answer, every essay draft, and every detail meticulously because I knew that this could be the first real step toward proving to myself and to my parents that I could succeed independently. And when I finally received the acceptance and the funding, it felt like a small but decisive victory, one that I celebrated privately. Because I didn't want them to know, not yet, not until I had everything I needed to finish what they had tried to take away from me. And in that moment, I realized that staying silent had been the right choice because it allowed me to build a foundation that no one could undermine or control, no matter how entitled or privileged they thought they were. Blake never knew the effort I put in, of course, and my parents never suspected the nights I spent working and writing essays, but I began to notice subtle shifts in how they interacted with me, small comments that hinted at frustration or confusion. And I smiled quietly to myself because I knew that every move I made was slowly flipping the script, that eventually the tables would turn, and they would learn that their attempts to favor Blake at my expense had consequences they had not anticipated, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction to know that I was already winning, even if they didn't realize it yet. By the time the semester started, I had not only secured my scholarship, but had also lined up part-time work that allowed me to cover all remaining expenses. And I walked into that first class with a sense of control and determination that I had never experienced before, knowing that I was building my future entirely on my own, and that every challenge, every sleepless night, and every frustration had prepared me to take what was rightfully mine and to eventually show my parents in ways they could not ignore that I had not only survived their betrayal, but had thrived because of it, which became my silent but powerful form of revenge that only grew as I continued forward. By the time I entered my second year of college, I had built a rhythm that kept me afloat, balancing work, school, and the quiet anger that had been simmering since I discovered that my parents had spent my tuition money on Blake. And every day felt like a small battle that I had to win without anyone noticing, because I was determined not to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much their betrayal had hurt me, and I started to realize that this independence, painful as it was, had begun to shape me into someone stronger, sharper, and far more capable than I had ever expected myself to be, which in turn gave me a quiet, growing sense of power that I had never felt in my life before. The kind of power that comes from proving you can survive and thrive without anyone holding your hand or supporting you, even when they promised they would. I began to notice how my parents' behavior changed in subtle ways as I became more self-sufficient, the casual comments about Blake's achievements becoming slightly sharper, the occasional insinuations about my lack of advantage slipping into forced smiles and awkward conversations, and I recognized that their attempts to undermine me were losing their impact because I no longer depended on them for anything, which became a source of quiet satisfaction, knowing that every decision I made and every step I took toward my own success was silently undermining the control they had always assumed they held. And the knowledge that I could play this game without ever exposing my strategy made me feel a mix of exhilaration and determination that kept me pushing even harder. Around this time, I met a professor who saw my drive and determination and offered guidance and mentorship that changed everything for me, not because I needed anyone's help, but because it opened doors I never thought I could reach on my own. Opportunities that required skill, intelligence, and hard work, all of which I had spent the past year sharpening, and I realized that these were the kinds of advantages my parents could never have given me, no matter how much money they spent on Blake. Because true growth, as I discovered, came from persistence, creativity, and the willingness to endure challenges without taking the easy path, and that realization fueled a quiet, simmering desire to ensure that the success I was building would not only surpass Blake's, but would do so in a way that my parents could not ignore or undo. During this period, I also started to think carefully about the future, about how I could leverage my independence and accomplishments to make a point without being cruel, and I began making plans that were patient, deliberate, and carefully calculated, knowing that my parents' favoritism had left them blind to the fact that the person they had tried to control was quietly building something far greater than they had imagined, and the idea of revealing it later, at the perfect moment, became a driving force behind everything I did, a hidden satisfaction that kept me motivated even during the long nights, the exhausting double shifts, and the mounting pressure of coursework that never seemed to end. I also began testing my boundaries with them, small things at first, tiny acts that forced them to acknowledge my presence and my choices without ever directly confronting the core betrayal, and I watched how they reacted, noting the frustration in their voices when I politely refused assistance, the subtle irritation when I corrected misinformation about financial matters, and the way they shifted uncomfortably when I proved that I could manage responsibilities they had assumed were impossible for me to handle alone, and each reaction became a piece of information I stored carefully, planning how I could turn it into the final move that would make my victory unmistakable. By the end of the year, I had secured not only my scholarship funding, but also internships and work opportunities that gave me experience, credibility, and independence. And while Blake was still enjoying the benefits of my parents' support and the prestige of his MBA, I realized that my trajectory was now entirely my own, one built on skill, perseverance, and strategy. And that awareness filled me with a sense of quiet triumph, the kind that grows slowly and becomes undeniable, and I understood that the real revenge was not in retaliation, but in building a life so fully my own that they could not influence, control, or diminish it, which gave me a sense of satisfaction that felt sharper and more powerful than anything I had ever imagined when I first discovered their betrayal, and I knew that the next step, when the time came, would be the moment where they would finally see that their choices had only made me stronger and more unstoppable. By the time I was in my final year, everything I had endured had begun to show results in ways my parents could not ignore, even though they still refused to acknowledge it openly. And there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the life I had been forced to build alone was starting to resemble exactly what I had imagined, one that required no assistance, no interference, and certainly no favoritism, which made the small moments of recognition, even when indirect, feel like victories I had earned with every ounce of effort, sleepless night, and ounce of determination I had poured into making my education, my career, and my independence real, and the fact that it had all been done on my own terms made the satisfaction even sharper. I began taking steps that would eventually make my parents realize the full extent of what they had lost when they chose to invest in Blake instead of me, starting with internships that led to real professional opportunities, ones that built my resume, credibility, and skill set beyond what most of my peers had, and I made sure that these opportunities were visible in ways that were subtle but undeniable, strategically sharing accomplishments with family and friends while carefully avoiding the emotional confrontation they expected or feared, and I could see the frustration growing in my parents' eyes when they realized that my path had advanced faster, stronger, and more effectively than Blake's. Despite their full investment in his education and lifestyle, and every hint of confusion, envy, or irritation was a reminder that the balance of power was shifting in ways they had never imagined. I started accepting invitations to networking events, conferences, and professional meetings that put me in contact with people who could open doors far beyond what my parents had ever promised me, and I intentionally sent updates, messages, or brief notes that allowed the achievements to reach them indirectly, never confrontational, never boastful, just factual evidence of my independence and progress, and I watched carefully how they reacted, noting every question, comment, or awkward pause. Because each of these small signals told me that my quiet victories were already resonating with the people who had once tried to control and undermine me, and it gave me a satisfaction that felt precise, measured, and deliberate, like a plan falling into place exactly as it should. Meanwhile, Blake continued to enjoy his MBA, blissfully unaware that the person he thought had been disadvantaged was actually building a life that would surpass anything he could achieve, and while my parents occasionally hinted at their pride in his success, I remained silent about the scholarships, internships, and professional connections that were positioning me for something far greater than their limited vision, and it became clear that my silence and focus had transformed the disadvantage they had imposed into the ultimate form of leverage, one that would be revealed at the perfect moment for maximum impact, leaving them with no room to claim superiority or control, and the thought of that day gave me a quiet thrill, a sense of strategy unfolding exactly as I had planned. By this stage, I had also begun making financial moves that ensured I would never be dependent on my parents or anyone else who had betrayed me, from carefully managed savings accounts to investments that grew slowly but steadily, all designed so that when the final confrontation occurred, it would be impossible for them to argue or undermine my independence, and the process of building these structures required patience, careful attention, and foresight, which were qualities I had honed through months of hard work, frustration, and silent determination, and the idea that I had achieved this without them realizing it reinforced the sense that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every insult had been transformed into fuel for the ultimate payback. As the final months of school approached, I could see that the tension within my family had reached a subtle but undeniable peak, with my parents beginning to question their assumptions about my trajectory and Blake unaware of how far ahead I had moved. And I started preparing the stage for the final moves, ensuring that when I revealed the truth of my accomplishments, it would land with maximum effect, undeniable and perfectly timed, the kind of revelation that left no room for debate, no ability to dismiss my success, and no chance to diminish the fact that the person they had underestimated, ignored, and betrayed had quietly turned every obstacle into a stepping stone toward complete independence, success, and vindication. And that awareness gave me a sense of control and satisfaction that was both exhilarating and intoxicating, because it was real, deliberate, and earned entirely on my own terms. By the time graduation arrived, I had spent years building every part of my life without my parents' support, carefully cultivating independence, skill, and a reputation that was entirely my own. And while they continued to celebrate Blake's achievements openly, I had grown to a point where their approval no longer mattered. And the idea that I could finally reveal the truth of my accomplishments without confrontation became the most compelling and satisfying goal I had ever set for myself. The culmination of years of hard work, sleepless nights, and quiet determination, and the thought of the moment when they would finally realize that every dollar they had spent on him had done nothing to stop my success filled me with a controlled, burning satisfaction that I had been holding onto for years. I arranged a small gathering under the guise of celebrating my own graduation, inviting only those who mattered professionally and personally, making sure that every detail reflected the life I had built through my own effort. And I knew that my parents would attend because they could never resist seeing me, even if they thought they had already won, and I watched as they arrived, smiling politely, speaking with that thin layer of superiority they always carried when they thought someone else owed them everything, and I realized that the perfect moment to reveal my quiet victories had finally arrived because everything I had built was now visible, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. When the time came, I stood and addressed the small gathering, speaking about the journey that had brought me here, focusing on the work, perseverance, and opportunities one had seized without asking for help, and I deliberately included the scholarships, internships, and professional achievements that had allowed me to graduate debt-free, gain recognition in my field, and establish independence, and I could see the shift in my parents' expressions as the reality sank in, their smiles stiffening, and the subtle tension between them and me becoming almost palpable, and the realization that I had done all of this without them, while they had diverted what should have been my tuition to Blake, began to settle in their minds as they realized for the first time that their choices had not just failed to stop me, but had actually fueled the exact outcome I wanted. Afterward, when the applause faded and the conversations moved on, I made sure to communicate the final part of my message, quietly and decisively, by informing my parents that I had no intention of providing them with any financial support, no loans, no gifts, no assistance, because every step of my independence had been built without their involvement, and the knowledge that they would never see a single dollar from me again hit them in a way that was controlled, final, and unavoidable, and I watched their faces as the reality became undeniable, and I felt a sense of satisfaction that was not cruel, but entirely justified, the kind that comes from proving a point through strategy, patience, and excellence rather than confrontation or vindictiveness. Blake, still blissfully unaware of the contrast between the path he had been given and the one I had forged, looked puzzled but polite. And I realized that he would always see my success as impressive without fully understanding the magnitude of what it had taken to achieve it, and that in itself was part of the victory, the quiet acknowledgement that the person he had underestimated, mocked, or ignored had not only survived but thrived and outpaced him in every meaningful way, leaving me in a position of control, pride, and independence that was entirely my own, untouched by favoritism or parental interference. As the event ended and people began to leave, I felt a release that was both intense and freeing, the culmination of years of struggle, silent planning, and deliberate patience finally paying off in a way that was undeniable. And the knowledge that my parents could no longer claim any authority over my life, my finances, or my choices brought a sense of closure that I had not thought possible when I first discovered their betrayal, and I knew that the final act, executed quietly, strategically, and without a single moment of public confrontation, had achieved exactly what I had planned, a moment of triumph that was entirely mine and completely justified, leaving no room for doubt, no ability to undermine me, and no chance for them to reverse the reality of my independence, and I realized that true power, patience, and intelligence could turn betrayal into victory in a way that was brilliant, satisfying, and unforgettable.